This is a wonderful event, and I'm so pleased to see all of you here. This event, Coming Home, Walter Kapp's Vietnam Class Reunion. Who would have thought in 1978, when Walter first taught this class, that it would become legendary, and that 30 years later, many who had enrolled in the course or were related in one way or another to the course would return to the campus for this event. It tells us something, of course, about war and its wounds, both back then and still today, but also about Walter himself, especially his way of connecting with the perplexity, pain, and passion arising around war. Before we turn to the program for today, I want to recognize several of our UCSB officials. Henry Young, our Chancellor. David Marshall, Executive Dean of the College of Letters and Science and Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts. George Thurlow, Executive Director and Assistant Vice Chancellor of the UCSB Alumni Association. Deidre O'Shea, Communications Director for the College of Letters and Science. And Leonard Wallach, Associate Director of the Walter H. Kapp Center. And of course, there's Representative Lois Capps. Now, I want to remind you, if you didn't already see the sign-up sheet, there is a sign-up sheet back here somewhere. We'll be back there when we leave. So if any of you care to be on our list of communicating with you about future programs, by all means, sign up when you leave. Now, I want to introduce my colleague in the Department of Religious Studies who will preside over today's program, Richard Hecht. Since 1995, he has taught the course that Walter established. In addition to taking the lead in arranging this event, Richard has been very involved in planning the entire series of the 10th year commemorative events sponsored by the Kapp Center. So please welcome Professor Hecht.
Clark, thank you very, very much. And I also join Clark in welcoming each and every one of you. And I want to ask a question. And all you have to do at this point is raise your hand. How many of you took the course between 1979 and 1989, the first decade? Raise your hands. Unfortunately, I can't see very well. Okay, a lot of people. Let me ask the next question. How many of you took the course between 1989 and 1995? Not as many, I think. And what about those who have taken it since 1995 to the present? How many of you are there? Okay, there are a few. I'm sorry that I can't really see with the lights, but you know, I've been teaching the course for 13 years, and it's an honor and privilege to do that. And I remember very well how Walter trained me to take his class. He said there are three things that you have to keep in mind as principles when you teach this course. Number one, he said, trust Wilson Hubble. Wilson is here. He's been working with a class for 27 years. That's more than a quarter century. You know, just think about that, a quarter century. And then I should add that if Walter were here, he'd say, trust Wilson Hubble and trust Jim Nolan. And Jim is here also in the front. And so the first principle was to trust Wilson and Jim. Second principle was always check out the people who are speaking, the veterans who come in to the class, because Walter wanted to ensure an authenticity of the narratives and what was told and what was taught in his class. Now, the third is really important for us and for you, and it's why I asked how many of you took it in this decade versus another. And what Walter said, he said, don't try to overprogram where the course is going to go, because you can't tell that. And he directed me to his syllabus, where he wrote each year, and this is in the syllabus, and we've kept it in the syllabus all these years. Each year, there is a new emphasis within the class, but only in a very few years has this emphasis been fully recognizable in advance. Part of the challenge each year is to discern the emphasis, whether it pertains to how women understand the war, how persons born in Vietnam and now living in the United States understand the war, or even to what new interpretive light is cast upon the war experiences by the latest analysis and theoretical appraisals, unquote. So we've kept that principle, but while the principle is there of watching the course evolve in a quarter, Walter also noted by 1995 that the course had developed. The first stage of the development of the course was welcoming the veterans home. That was a very, very significant part of the course, and Walter always ended each and every session or presentation by the veterans by asking the class to welcome them home. I was speaking to a veteran in the back who said, "I'm glad I'm home." And so that's that same process, I believe. So that was the first phase. The second phase, as Walter understood it, was the telling of a narrative. And he began to realize that the telling of that narrative had therapeutic results. And when I took the course in '95, he said, "Richard, that something is going on. I don't know what it is. I can't put my finger on it." And it emerged in the first years that I was teaching the course, and I call it binding the generations together. And by binding the generations together, I mean that you have students whose parents don't tell them about their experiences. We always ask at the beginning of the course, how many of you have a relative parent who's a veteran? And we get hands and we ask, do your parents talk about it? No. And of course, this has become more complex because we now have Vietnamese American students whose parents came to the country in 1975, 76, and 77, and they don't tell their parents, they don't tell their children their experiences of why they left Vietnam. And for some of us who've been in the course since the 1990s, Quang Pham, whose father was in the South Vietnamese Air Force, his father stayed in 1975 and spent, I believe, 18 years in prison of the Vietnamese regime. And this, what bothered Quang throughout his life, that he really resolved, is how he could explain the fact that in the plane that left, there were people who he knew who were no longer in the military uniform of the South Vietnamese. They were in civilian clothing. And so this led Quang to graduate from high school in Oxnard with honors, to go on to UCLA and receive honors, to enter the Marine Corps, where he became the first Vietnamese American attack helicopter pilot, decorated in the Gulf War. And then all the years since 1991 as an activist trying to recreate a new Vietnamese American memory to replace the loss of their memory. And then, so that's going on. So Walter sensed that. And then, of course, the last change is the new veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. And we have tried to incorporate them and their issues into the course over the last 3 years. Now, while all that is changed, something has not changed, and that is there are students who have taken the course like you who always tell the same thing. It's a life-changing course. It's the most important course that they've ever taken. It's the best course. That's been going on for 29 years. That's constant. Now, Walter would end each quarter of the class by challenging students to do something with what they have learned in these narratives of the veterans and others. Perhaps the course itself, I think, was one of the dynamics that led Walter to his public service and his election in the Congress, and why he generated so much respect among his fellow members of the House of Representatives in just a short few months. I'm asking you to reconsider that question that Walter asked you, and if you weren't there, to consider it again now. I'm asking you to consider that question once again. Some of us will remember Charlie Plum, who posed the question to us. Charlie spent nearly 6 years in the Hanoi Hilton in an 8-by-8-foot prison cell. He was blasted out of the sky in his 75th combat mission. And remember, his story was he didn't know who packed his parachute. Remember the guy down there that he had never met? And so his question to you was, who packed your parachute and who are you packing the parachute for? And that's a very important lesson, and it's the same question that Walter would ask. Today I've asked Congresswoman Lois Capps, who succeeded Walter as our district's representative in the House of Representatives, and is now, I believe, a 5-term member of the Congress. Wilson Hubble, my great, wonderful colleague, who served as a CH-47 helicopter crew member in Vietnam from 1966 to 68. Jim Nolan, my other wonderful colleague, who served as an infantry rifleman from September 1966 to June 1967. James Quay, the former executive director of the California Council for the Humanities and a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, to share with us what they have done with the class or how the class has changed their lives. And when they're finished, we're going to have a kind of town hall meeting for, I hope, a half hour, where we can talk with one another about what this course has meant to us, even if we're just hangers-on. I met someone outside who said, I didn't take the course, I got a extension course from my wife, who took the course in the early 1980s. So I want us to listen to what each of these very, very important people has done with the course over the many years that we've taught it, that it's been in existence, and then we're going to have a discussion about that same question. What have we done with this course? Please welcome now Representative Lois Capps.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for Professor Hecht, for your introduction and for organizing this reunion of the class, gathering together this panel and including me in it, and allowing for this discussion, which I've been looking forward to so very much. Thank you also for continuing to teach the class, and to the Department of Religious Studies for sponsoring it. RS 155, is it still called that? The impact of the Vietnam War on American religion and culture. It used to be, I think, on American life, whatever. Thank you as well to the UCSB reunion team, to Alumni Center George Thurlow, whose idea, I believe it was, at least that's how it was presented to me, away last winter at the Chancellor's holiday party, to include this session as part of your All Gaucho reunion weekend. And I appreciate that the Chancellor and other administrators are here when there's a lot going on. This school year marks the 10th anniversary of Walter's death. I commend and thank as well the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life. You've listened to Clark Roof, the director, and Leonard Wallach, assistant director, for including this gathering in the year-long schedule of commemorative events, and more about that later. Most especially, I thank the Vietnam War veterans and those associated with this war that have made you the natural and effective teachers of the class over all these years. And I thank you, especially former students, who also had a powerful role in the class. I look forward to our discussion time to hear what impact, if any, it has had on you in these years since graduating. Since I was never enrolled in the class, nor was I a teacher or a presenter, it may seem strange to me as well as to you that I'm included in the panel, but I want you to know how much it means for me to be with you today. This opportunity has encouraged me to reflect on the role and the impact the class had on Walter. It had a powerful impact on him. And I talk about this now from my perspective over the course of the 2 decades that he taught it and since. Of course, the influence of the veterans, those here today and the many, many others over the years, was enormous. You touched him so profoundly. You reordered his thinking and his priorities. He cared about you a great deal. I have developed a thesis about the class from the vantage point of the person who succeeded Walter in office after his death. I believe that this course, and Richard, you alluded to this, which you all actually developed together over all the years and all of the phases and decades of it, was in itself a very major part of what led him to run for public office and to become a member of Congress. I'll explain, but first a bit of the history of the class, the beginnings of it, revisionist as it is through my eyes. Walter and I came to Santa Barbara in 1964. Is that okay? That's good with me. He became a young, oh good, I can see people now. Well, all right. He became a young assistant professor at the brand new Department of Religious Studies here at UCSB. Again, that was 1964. His early years of teaching were profoundly influenced by the strong anti-war sentiment, which tore through the very fabric of this country during those years, and especially college campuses like UCSB. The bank burned. Sheriff's deputies were in riot gear, seemingly everywhere. But soon, another shadowy story began to emerge, the plight of the returning soldier. At the same time, a think tank had moved from the University of Chicago to a Santa Barbara hillside estate, a Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, the Hutchins Center. Walter was honored to be a fellow there and came home one day, especially moved by a discussion featuring two Purple Heart decorated Vietnam vets, Fred Downs, a landmine survivor, Shad Meshad, who began the storefront Viet Center movement. Their language was like none other had ever been heard there, raw and powerful. Their stories, they said, and other stories like theirs, were not being heard, were not being listened to. He listened. He decided to try to find a way for these stories to be shared and to be responded to, and thus came to be the format for RS 155. Now, I'm sure this was not the first time that the first-person narrative was ever used to portray the content of academic subject matter, but as I trust some of you will be describing during our discussion period, the course was not simply hearing a story being told, often for the first time. There was, in that telling and in that listening, a relationship which developed. A welcome home, it's been mentioned, but a profoundly reciprocal communication and relationship between the student and the teacher, meaning the vet. That ongoing dialogue exposed some fundamental values. And to the extent that this was an American experience, it led Walter to consider, as the years passed and as the course evolved, the role of individual stories in the life of a democracy like ours. You see, he too was so deeply affected by what was going on in Campbell Hall and the occasional pilgrimages which were made to the Vietnam Memorial. He felt enormously humbled by and privileged to be a part of the healing which he witnessed, which he experienced too, which can occur in such a setting, and the insights, the pain, which can be also shared and gained in that context. And as he observed those in public life around him, he could begin to tell which leaders had been influenced by this kind of powerful story of individuals such as he had been witness to. And he applauded those who were moved to action as a result. Walter often referenced the philosopher whose thesis was that democracy is born in conversation. Many of you heard him say this. He began to see that the genius of our founding fathers was to create a government in which one branch would include a House of Representatives called the People's House, where public policy can be developed based on stories of individuals of constituents. And so Walter ran for Congress in 1994, again, successfully this time in 1996. As Richard and other of his colleagues know, it was with great reluctance that he gave up teaching at UCSB. He somehow magically thought he could do both things, but he did extract a promise that when he retired from Congress, he could return. But he took the same enthusiasm, the same ear for the story, to our nation's capital, along with, I might add, the same corny jokes. I was there with him, and I saw the same attentiveness he showed to those around him, individuals with stories to share, not individuals known as Democrats or Republicans. You know, he was in office only 10 and a half months before he died suddenly, but he had already established a role as a statesman, rising above the pettiness and partisanship by being attentive to the varieties, the rich varieties of stories that he heard there and their underlying themes. One of the important lessons that came out of RS 155, and that has been reinforced by the Vietnam Veterans of America and others, is the falsehood and the tragedy of blaming the warrior for the war. And that is a real accomplishment on the face of it. But there are other discouraging similarities between the Vietnam veterans who are still with us and still bearing the scars, and the newer, younger Iraqi and Afghanistan vets of today. Homelessness, joblessness, abuse of alcohol and drugs still exist, still continue. The number now of traumatic brain injuries and PTSD not being adequately diagnosed or treated is a real indictment of lessons not adequately learned. It wasn't until we finally changed leadership in the Congress recently that we could pass the largest increase in veterans' health care benefits since the VA began, but we need to do so much more. It was my legacy from this class and the lessons I learned indirectly from you veterans, which made me oppose the war in Iraq right from the beginning. I had no other choice. I could not vote to give our president authority to engage in a preemptive, unilateral attack on another country. I know Walter would agree. And I appreciate the silent vigil given each Sunday at Arlington West by the Veterans for Peace. If you're here from out of town this weekend and have not experienced this apolitical tribute to the lives of our military shed in Iraq and Afghanistan, I encourage you to stop by tomorrow from sunrise to sunset. And finally, I want to say one word about the challenges facing each of us here today. I didn't say that quite as directly as Richard did. But you know, the welcome home does continue. I'm thankful to Richard and to the department for continuing the class. And I'm thankful for the CAP Center for the study of ethics, religion, and public life. That it exists not as much a legacy to one professor as a continuation of that challenge of what happened in RS 155 and the ways that the common good in the public sphere today and tomorrow can be enhanced by those ways that we can share our own stories and listen to the stories of others. And I'm going to close with one example from Walter. Interestingly, it is a quote that was put in a eulogy by Walter's colleagues after his death, and it was put there by the sister of Pham, Tu Pham. She was a student of Walter's as well, and his first volunteer on his campaign in 1994, and a staff member after that, and a dear friend to many of us. This is what she quoted from Walter's speech that he gave when he announced he was running for Congress. It was 2 years before his death, on November 14th, 1995. He said at that time, "You must know that I've been a professor for 30 years and have enjoyed the respect and esteem of thousands of young people. Many of them are wishing that I would not throw myself into politics. They recognize that there are too many pitfalls there, too many opportunities to lose one's respect and jettison one's esteem I trust that I can prove them wrong. I sincerely hope that their respect will be sustained and even increased by what we are trying to do. I'm out there because I love this country and because I think we have made great progress in recent years, but there is still so much more to do. I would like to help restore the bond of trust between the citizens and their elected representatives in Washington. And then later, the truth is that we are best as a people when we work for the common good, when we exercise regard for those who are the least among us. We are the strongest as a people when we are directed by that which unites us rather than giving in to the fears, the suspicions, the innuendos, and the paranoias that divide us. So it is entirely up to us to decide what means most to us and how we are going to give priority to this in our decisions and our behavior. For when it is all over, the histories about this time will be about us, as they were about Walter. Thank you.
It is good to see you again. Welcome back to UCSB. Yes, we're still here. Religious Studies 155 continues on every winter quarter. If you happen to find yourself on campus then, please stop by and pay us a visit. There is still a place for you here and always will be. Although some features of Religious Studies 155 remain the same, like the journal assignment, those of you who took the class remember the journal assignment, and Father's Day, when veterans come in, who are the fathers or grandfathers or relatives of students in the class. And of course, there's still me talking about helicopters and the dreaded FNG. Remember the FNG? The FNG is, well, we don't need to go there. The class evolves in response to events that are currently happening in the outside world. The class evolves over time. And it also depends on what speakers are available at a particular time. Sometimes we get lucky when somebody happens to be passing through. And over the years, we've had Vietnam veterans, conscientious objectors, and people who protested the American involvement in Southeast Asia. But as some of you may recall, we've also had Russian veterans from the Soviet war in Afghanistan, Sasha and Igor, who came from Moscow. That was interesting. We've had South Vietnamese veterans, a North Vietnamese military veteran, Vietnamese Americans, political leaders, American veterans from the first Gulf War, authors, members of the media, and most recently, American military veterans from the current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in Vietnam 40 years ago, but a few weeks ago, I listened to an Army sergeant tell of her experience in Iraq, and I could hear some of my own voice in some of the words that she spoke. I remember first stepping into Campbell Hall nervously. The place was filled, and now I was going to out myself as a Vietnam veteran in front of all these people. Yeah, I was nervous, and no wonder. Nearly 60,000 of us had died. Hundreds of thousands more had been wounded, and many others bore the spiritual scars from what we had seen and what we had done and what had been done to us in Vietnam. In the end, the outcome of the war, and this is important, was the same as it would have been if we had never been there. Our presently, essentially, had meant nothing. All that blood, all that sweat, all those tears, and the only thing we changed was the calendar. When it was over, America wanted to forget this nightmare and forget us too, if only it could. But now I found myself sitting in the front row of Campbell Hall. They put us in the front row. What's that about? surrounded by strangers. At first, I was skeptical. Who is this UCSB professor, and what does he think he knows about Vietnam? But Walter quickly gained my trust and the trust of other veterans by telling us that it was what we know about Vietnam that is important, and he was trying to learn about it from us and from others. And together, we could educate his students. He wanted us to be there, and he wanted us to help, and so we did. Walter recognized the torment of many Vietnam veterans and the grief of too many family members and the struggle of everyone who had to survive and move on through those troubled times. Walter came to believe that the experience of all these people was having an effect on American culture, and there were important messages in the voices of those who had to confront this war. He also believed that these experiences, the ones that many people wanted to forget, should be the topic for a class where they were presented and examined and discussed. Walter had this Walter had this disarming style about him. Part humility, part humor. It was Uncle, what was Uncle? Uncle Milt. Yeah, Uncle Milt. He used to tell Uncle Milton stories. Part charm and part subtle assertiveness that served him well. When he first wanted to teach this class, the university was not real keen on the idea. But he was able to get a reluctant university to go along with it. Many people with many different experiences would come to help many others. And when Walter left for Congress, Richard Hecht stepped forward, and the journey continues to this day. And those veterans who came to the class then and now learned that there were many things about this war we do not know. For most of us, our knowledge of Vietnam is based on what we were doing, where we were at, when we were there in Vietnam. At UCSB, we are presented with a much broader picture of the war and what it meant to us and our country. And we too have been educated by Walter and Richard and all they bring to the class. It has always been so much more than just war stories. The class became and remains an instrument of healing for old wounds and making new beginnings. My personal story of life before, during, and after Vietnam, the one I've presented here for nearly 25 years, was developed because Walter asked me to tell it. Until then, it had just been a series of disjointed memories that in some instances I had tried to forget. Just putting it together so that it could be presented was a cathartic experience. My parents never heard this story. My brother has never heard it either, although both my parents and my brother actually lived through the story with me. Basically, I only tell the story at UCSB because I believe it can make a difference here. You see, if just one student can take what I tell them and learn something from it, then my experience and the experience of those who were with me in Vietnam did mean something after all. So in reality, this class is not about me. It is, and it always has been, about you, the students who have taken this, and what you do with it. I tell the students that they have three choices in life. You can lead, you can follow, or you can get out of the way. But because of who they are and where they are today, we expect them to lead. And if they are to lead, stories like mine just may be important. And those of us who survived must tell others what we know. Thanks for listening.
Good afternoon. My name is Jim Nolan. And oddly enough, I have realized that I'm the only one on this panel who never met Walter. When I started coming to this class, when Wilson first asked me, it was already after Walter's death. So I never had the honor of meeting him. There's many, I can't tell any stories about him. But I was a young man who got out of high school and joined the Marine Corps, and they taught us how to fight, how to win wars. And they sent us over to a place and that wasn't anything like any place we'd ever been before. And we weren't making much progress at first, so we were trying new things, new tactics all the time. They had trained us for killing. They had trained us to fight. They had even trained us how to help our fellow Marines if they were hurt. But they didn't really prepare us for what happens in war, because what happens in war is the things that are unexpected. When I first came to Campbell Hall and stood, it had been 33 years since I had been in Vietnam. It was 33 years since I had told anyone I'd been in Vietnam. It was 33 years since I had really admitted that I'd been there. And I told stories. It wasn't just the telling the story. I was asked to get up and just talk and tell what had happened. And it became more than that, because I immediately understood that there was a lot of symbolism going on. The people we were talking to were the 20, 21, 22, 23-year-old college students that were so cruel to us when we came home. When I was when I was 21 and came back from Vietnam, it was those young college students that picked up their verbal rocks and verbally stoned us and sent us away from their community and wouldn't allow us to be part of our own generation. They shunned us. And it was these students that we were speaking to. And it wasn't just a matter of telling the story. I think that the genius of what Walter set up was the fact that this wasn't a history class. It wasn't a political science class. It wasn't a military tactic class. It was a religion class. And one by one, we got up as veterans and we confessed. And we asked to be forgiven because we wanted to repent and we wanted to make ourselves whole again because we had lost something of ourselves there. When you were asked to kill someone, when you were asked to become someone who's capable of taking another life, it changes you. A little bit of you dies too. And that's what we needed back. And that's what we needed to be forgiven for. And that's what the class provides. Sorry. The idea of existing to just kill or be killed, that takes your humanness away from you. If you don't care about other people, if you don't care how they feel or what's going on, then you're just an animal and you're just going through the motions. And we needed to be able to stand up and say, I'm sorry that I became that person. I'm sorry I became someone who could kill. And I needed to be forgiven. And these surrogate students, these new students that we told these stories to, instead of standing up and throwing their verbal rocks and their slings and arrows at us, they applauded. And they said, welcome home. And that's how the healing can start. And that's the genius of the class and the genius of what Walter started, is healing. We heal people and we heal the nation one heart at a time, one person at a time, one class at a time. And we were able to accomplish this. So I never met Walter. I never had the honor of shaking his hand. But I would like to thank him and thank my friend Walter Capps for having the vision to start something that could be so meaningful. Thank you.
Hi. Wilson Hubble tells a story about the statue that is near the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And he says that for him, there are sentries that represent all who went to Vietnam, watching over the memorial. And I just want to say that for me, Congresswoman Capps and Richard Hecht and Wilson Hubble are the sentries who are looking over this course, which has meant so much to so many. And I want to thank you for that. I was privileged to tell my story about a dozen times between 1985 and 2000 about how I came to be a conscientious objector during those years. But today I've been asked to speak about how the course changed my life. My first meeting with Walter was when I was a reporter with California Public Radio. It was in December of 1982, and he had just finished writing the book, The Unfinished War. And it was about the time, I think in November of '82, that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated. And I found myself just glued to and listening for NPR coverage about that dedication, and particularly drawn to the reading of the names that were on the memorial. Something very powerful about the reading of those names. And when I was talking to Walter, he mentioned the course that had just started a few years before. And I said, do you ever have anybody who protested the war come and speak? And he said, no, I never have, but I'll consider it. And a few months later, I covered the first conference. It was at USC, called Vietnam Reconsidered, Lessons from the War. It was the first conference since the end of the war on Vietnam in the United States. And I found myself listening to journalists, et cetera, but there was one session, just one session, in which the vets spoke, and it was by far the most searing and intense testimony I had ever heard. And I knew that Walter was absolutely right. The war was not over. And not only was the war not over for veterans, but as a kind of corollary to what Jim just said, it wasn't over for the country, because the country was responsible for sending the soldiers in the first place. So anything that was done over there was done in our name, and we bore responsibility for that. So we too needed forgiveness. Now, as it turned out, I met Walter again a few months later when I was a candidate to become the director of the California Council for the Humanities, and Walter Capps was the chair of the council. And through a miraculous set of circumstances, I became the director, and Walter and I started to work together on a very regular basis. And in 1984, Walter asked me if I would come to his class and tell my story, and I said I would. It turned out, this was now in winter of '85, that, and I didn't know this, that CBS was filming the entire course for what was then going to be the first piece on 60 Minutes. And I remember vividly speaking into a bank of lights, telling my story for the first time, and Denver Mills, who I had hoped would be here today and who's not, I just remember when I was finished, there was a voice out there that said, "I hear in your story some of the anguish and isolation and alienation that veterans have felt. And so I want to welcome you home," and receive the same applause that veterans had. Now, I quickly demurred, because I did not want anyone to think that I felt that I had lost a fraction of what I think veterans lost by going to Vietnam. But it was an extremely generous welcome home. I appreciated it. I told Denver then, and I would tell him again now if he were here. Because it was, as Jim said, it was, Walter offered an occasion to tell a story where you have to, first of all, make the story make sense to you, and then hope that it will make sense to others. And so I had to figure out what pressures and values had made me become a conscientious objector. But the main part of my story takes place outside the course, but happens because of the course. Walter gave my name, as it turned out, to the Smithsonian, which was then putting together a book of photographs on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And I was asked to write a short preface along with Jan Scruggs, John Wheeler, who had put together really gotten the memorial built, and William Westmoreland, who you may have heard of. And in writing the preface, I thought about the first time I had gone to the wall and the name that I had looked for. And the name was that of Glendon Waters. And I didn't know Glendon Waters. Glendon Waters, in November of 1969, there was a big moratorium march against the war. 500,000 people were there. But the night before, there was something called the March Against Death, at which 40,000 of us marched from the Arlington Bridge to the White House and then to the Capitol with the name of an American soldier who'd been killed in Vietnam. We paused at the White House to shout the name at the White House. And the name I was given by random was Glendon Lee Waters. And all I knew about Glendon Lee Waters was that he was from Texas. That's all I knew. But when I was sitting in my living room in August of '86 writing this preface, I just suddenly knew that I had to know more about Glendon Waters. I knew from my visit to the wall that he was 39 when he died, which was quite unusual, that he died on July 7th, 1967, about the same time I took part in the first anti-war demonstration. And I sent a letter to the next of kin, to the Navy, saying, please send this letter to the next of kin of Glendon Waters, explaining about the prologue, the preface, and offering to send a copy of the book, should they wish it, to the family. About 6 weeks later, I'd sort of forgotten about the letter. A letter arrived with unknown handwriting, and I opened it up. And I read this. Dear Mr. Quay, thank you for writing to me. It took time to get to me. I am the widow of Glendon Lee Waters. We were married 22 and a half years and had 2 children. He was a very dedicated Marine, and we were very proud of him. He gave his life so that we could have a free country. Your words are a tribute to Glendon, and I appreciate them. I would love to have a copy of the book and would treasure having it. If you would care to talk to me, you may call. Yours truly, Anna Carver. Well, I was completely covered with goosebumps after I read that. I gave the letter to my wife, who read it and burst into tears. And I knew I was suddenly in some very deep water. And I called Anna, of course, and after a few conversations, she very generously agreed to let me come and interview her and members of the family. So I sent Anna a video cassette of the speech I had given at Walter's class, so she would know who I was and would know something about the stranger that she had very generously invited into her life. So I flew into the Fayetteville. She lived in West Fork, Arkansas. I know you all know where West Fork, Arkansas is. I flew into the Fayetteville airport, and she was not supposed to meet me there. I was going to rent a car and go to a Holiday Inn and then call. But as I'm going through this very tiny terminal, I hear a voice say, "Jim?" And I look down, and I recognize the voice from the phone. And I said, "Anna, you weren't supposed to meet me here." And she said, "Well, I had an advantage. I knew what you looked like, but you did not know what I looked like." And I said, "Oh, you're checking me out. Anna, what if I'd been a creep?" She said, "I would have gone home and not answered my phone this evening." But she said there's a second reason that I came, and that is that when we watched the video, my husband, Kenneth, a 20-year Marine Vietnam veteran, a man of very few words, said, "I could tell that young man a thing or two. And I just want you to know that his bark is worse than his bite. He may say a few words, but it's going to be okay." So I said, "Okay, fine." Now, I went to the home. I interviewed Anna. I interviewed her children, Glendon's brother, and I interviewed Kenneth Carver. He had never talked about the war to anyone before. And I knew just enough about the war to ask him serious questions and to listen. And when the weekend was over and I was leaving, he shook my hand and he said, "You are welcome here anytime." Now, for me, some part of the Vietnam War ended at that moment. The deep division that I had felt in the country ended. And it wasn't just that time had healed the wounds, but that I had learned that the act of respectful listening can bridge the most enormous gulfs. Anna and I still exchange Christmas cards, by the way, so I'm still in touch with the family. Several years later, I tracked down other people who'd been in Glendon's unit. Vincent Palmieri in Brooklyn, Robert Smith in Montrose, Vondell Dunlap in Houston, Texas. And I remember Sergeant Dunlap's wife telling me that her husband had never talked about this with anyone. And during our interview, she and her teenage son sat quietly in the kitchen listening to my questions and her husband, his father's answers. Now, this experience profoundly changed my personal and professional life. Walter was not just a scholar and a professor of the humanities, he was a practitioner of the humanities. He put it into practice. It wasn't just books and reading papers, it was something else. And to practice the humanities doesn't mean to do what professional humanists do, which is mostly to write papers and give lectures. All of these are a means to a greater end, which is to imagine the lives of other people in other places, at other times, in other circumstances. And I think that this course changes lives because it asks students to do that and gives them the occasion to do that. to exercise their moral imaginations. Bob Carey at Walter's memorial service described his experience in the class this way. We stood to face 1,000 young students who sat across the gulf made by our differences. We stood and spoke. We told our stories. We surrendered our secrets because we trusted Walter. We trusted that he would hear us. We trusted that his judgment would be kind. Walter's gift was that he saw spirit where others saw physical characteristics. He did not just see black and brown and white. He saw more than fat and skinny, beautiful or ugly, old or young. He did not see the things or experiences that make us different. He saw the thing that makes us the same. So the experience confirmed for me the power of listening. Once Kenneth Carver and the other men I interviewed would have stood on two sides of a very wide political divide. But my desire to hear their story and their willingness to tell it bridged that divide. I believe the act of listening is a moral act, and that the gift of one's attention is one of the greatest gifts you can give to another human being. I believe that gift has powerful healing properties. It doesn't solve all problems, it doesn't bridge all divides, but it is a powerful solvent and an essential first step. And the whole of my professional life at the California Council for the Humanities has been informed by this conviction, which is it's all about stories across divides. This course changed my life, and I shall always be grateful that I had Walter Capps as a mentor and as a friend. Now, Richard asked me to end my presentation with the poem that I used to end my testimony with. I wrote it for a class that I taught in 1977, but it was certainly appropriate for the students in Walter's class, and it's called The Last Assignment. I came here in my imagination several days ago and received a gift. I have written it down. It is a poem to you. The poem was not what I came here for. I came to speak to you, and that speaking became the poem. And if a poem falls to the ground and no one hears it, it might as well be a tree. So if you give me your attention, please, one last time. I have one last assignment for you and your attention, one last time. You won't turn this one in to me. I won't be here. You need neither pencil nor paper. I don't know how much time you have. You don't either. The form of this assignment is the content of your life. Use whatever margins you wish. That's all. That's all I can tell you because I did not really give you this assignment. I'm only here to remind you. I think that's part of my assignment. What I do know, what I can tell you, what makes it an assignment is it ends someday. I know we didn't discuss this in class, but you should know it for the final. I don't know how much time you have. You don't either. You may begin now. Please begin now. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Tom Lewis. I'm not a public speaker. I took Walter's class. I'm a vet. And he gave me the opportunity to speak in front of all those students in Campbell Hall. When I was in junior college back east in what I call the land of Endarkenment, New Jersey, I used to have to take a handful of diet pills to get up in front of a class to speak. But when Walter gave me this opportunity, I realized that I could not pass it up. Today, I could not pass up the opportunity to open my heart. As I understand, the question was, how have I used what Walter has taught me in my life? I could make it a long story or a short one. But after I took his class, I was connected with a group up in San Francisco. I met a woman, and I'm going to take this opportunity because it very rarely gets acknowledged, but those partners of us who served over there and who stayed with us and been by our side and loved us have made a difference in our lives that has allowed us to be not part of a statistic, but here living and talking about what our experience was. I heard a saying once, you can always tell what the intention was by the results you produced. Well, I have a woman in my life that's been there for a little over 15 years. It was about 20 years ago when I took Walter's class. And what I've learned was, what Walter was about was unconditional love. And I took that message of unconditional love when I met this young woman, or this woman. She wasn't young at the time. My head thinks I'm back at 21 still, but her son had just seen Top Gun for the 21st time and was making regular appearances at the Navy Recruiter downtown San Francisco. I happened to have a copy of Walter's class from 60 Minutes. I said to him, Jan, I said, would you look at something on TV with me for a minute? I showed him the tape, and then I have a box of slides that I took over in Vietnam that have been seen twice. I took them out of the closet and showed it to him. He stopped going to see the recruiter. And the miracle is that I now have a stepson where I wasn't blessed with a son, and I have two granddaughters who are half Chinese. If you didn't sleep through that part of the class, that was the enemy back in 1966 and 67. And the other grandmother was training in Mongolia with an AK-47. And through Walter's ability to love people and open his heart up, he's allowed me to open my heart up. I thought I could never open up again. And he has given me miracles beyond belief. And thank you, Walter. And thank you, Lois, for following in his footsteps.
I'm going to stand out of the bright light. I'm not a front row kind of person. I'd rather be back there with the friends I came with, but they pushed me up here. And I've always felt, I guess, the need to sort of share my testimony to this class and to Walter and the gifts that we all took away from this class and from Walter. I was here in 1982 to 1986, and I took Walter's class actually twice. In my senior year, independent study, because I remembered it so much from my sophomore year. And anyway, that was the time that it just truly changed me forever and changed my entire life. And to this day, it continues to be. I live in Arlington, Virginia now, and I still volunteer at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So I think about this often because it continues to be just a cornerstone of who I am, and I talk about it's still very much a touchstone, just like the wall. So it's been 22 years, and it's still very difficult to just speak about this very succinctly. And I see Claudia Caution here, who moved with me in 1986 to Washington, D.C. We both continued our passion and everything that we took from Walter's class and worked with Sandy Foriel and Jack Wheeler, who were key players in the Memorial Fund. And it just stuck with me very much then, and since then I've moved on. I just continue to do what I can, and I just all the stories that were shared were just so profound. And here I was, a 20-year-old and a 22-year-old sitting there listening to these amazing, angry, loving, passionate, everything stories and thinking, I have not experienced anything in the slightest, element of that in my life. And why had I never heard more about the war? Why had I never met these people and heard about it? And it just really got under my skin and, really screwed me up for a long time, basically. Trying to make sense of my life and what am I here for, my purpose, my direction, and all that. And I think I still, it's a journey, and I just honor that so much. And so much of that is because of the speakers that shared from their heart and their soul. And I have kids now, 10 and 6, and from this class and from Walter and who he was and the way that he taught, which was so out of the box for my time here, and part of it being the nature of the class, but part of it just the wonderful, gracious, gentle man that he was, and how generous he was to us as students who were going through these really crazy experiences of our own, and how we would call him and write him after the fact, and he was always so patient and so sincere in how he responded to our journey. And that is forever the greatest gift that I left here with, and I still try and honor that when I'm at the wall. And so in terms of just the humanity of this class, and I just hope that I honor what I learned then and what I took away, and try now to share that with my kids, that they walk a path of sincerity and embracing people of all sizes, shapes, colors, and experiences. So thank you.
Thank you. Before we have our last speaker, who's my colleague, Maishi Bernstein, Wilson reminded me of one of our students who took the course this past quarter, who at the very end of it, she came forward and she said, before I took this course, I didn't know what I was going to do in my life. I had no idea of what would happen to me after I left UCSB. And she looked at Wilson and she said, now I'm going to work for the VA.
My name is Maishi Bernstein. I'm actually Irish. I came here to UCSB in 1971, and Mim, where are you? You may have been a student of mine, I don't know, I was a TA then. So I was here in the last of the riots. And the reason why I wanted to come up was I did meet Walter in passing in the corridor in South Hall, and Lois, I've met you a few times. The class has also resonations for people who never took it. I didn't have a chance. I was always teaching when the class was on. But I teach a class on Vietnam right now, a Writing 50 class, and one of my students is here, I see as well. I taught it because Walter gave a voice to Vietnam in UCSB. And when people say to me, you're Irish, why are you teaching this class on Vietnam? I do it because Walter had started his class, and I heard so many wonderful things about it. And in my class, too, we've had similar experiences. I must be honest, this afternoon I've spent my time in tears listening to you guys, and I'm sorry I couldn't take the class. Because also I have the students with the same. I say, how many of you had parents, unfortunately now grandparents, who were in Vietnam or in the experience? They raise their hands and they say, did you ever talk to your father or mother about this? And they say no. And I say, well, now your assignment is to go home and talk to them. And I had a student last year, Matthew Ward, who told me a story, and we've been trying to find the family of his uncle Ken, who wrote letters from Vietnam, and it follows the trajectory, the gung-ho, maybe Top Gun kind of guy who goes into the army, and within a year has the letters become so traumatic and so dysfunctional. And he comes home, and a year later, he dies in a bicycle car accident, like so many veterans who died mysteriously that way. His wife took their young son and vanished to Oklahoma. So I said to Matthew, and they found the cache of letters that Ken had written. I said, find these letters, write up the article. We're going to try and get this published so that this young man who did not know his father was a Vietnam vet can learn the story of his father. So this is Walter. I think this is the resonation that Walter has made for all of us at UCSB, not just for those who took the class, were fortunate enough to take the class, but for those who would have heard of the class, who knew of the class. I used Walter's book, by the way. I used 2 articles, Mahadi's It Don't Mean Nothing, and Broyles, Why Men Love War. And they're always a wonderful source for discussion. So Lois, I want to thank you. I want to thank you gentlemen this afternoon for a very moving and inspiring talk. Thank you very much.
We're gonna get you, but I want to get Liz Sharp, who just took the course 2 years ago, and she'll talk about the course in, I assume, recent years. Liz?
Yeah. So I took the class of Religious Studies 155, The Impact of the Vietnam War, last year. I'm a junior this year. My dad is a Vietnam vet. He was in the Army, and I think he went overseas from 67 to 69. I'm not really sure on the details. But yeah, this class was like my first opportunity to actually find out about that part of my dad's life. And on Valentine's Day, Professor Hecht had us bring in all of the Vietnam vets that we knew. So I brought in my dad, and it was really cute because it was on Valentine's Day. And so I got to learn about like that part of his life, and then he hadn't come to visit me since he dropped me off in the dorms. So after the class, it ended about 6:30 or 7 or so. I actually took him to Isla Vista and got to show him about, teach him about my life. So, yeah, actually another kid who was in the class with me invited us over to his house, and we taught my dad how to play beer pong. So it was my favorite Valentine's Day ever because I got to spend it with my dad. He was the best Valentine ever. And I also got to learn about all the things that he went through, that he told me like the funny stories before of like, there was a monkey who, they were painting the barracks yellow, and there was a monkey around their, like where they were painting, and the monkey tipped the paint bucket over on himself. So the monkey was yellow. That's like the only story he ever told me before, besides like being afraid of their base getting attacked. And yeah, so I got to learn, I don't know, he's raised me with a lot of his ideas that I think are a result of his experiences in the Vietnam War. Like, don't just listen to people blindly, always question what their motives are, and just keep an open mind. And yeah, so this class really helped me a lot to like understand where he's coming from and to be able to relate to Vietnam vets on a personal level, and also more vets, because there's plenty of wars to come, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Liz. Liz is a religious studies person, and I remember the words you said after your father spoke. You came up to me and you said, he'd never said any of that to me. This is the first time I'd ever heard it. It was just so moving. We're going to have one more comment, and then I'd like you to just stay right where you are. I know we're coming to the end of this schedule, but I have a couple of things I want to say to you before we leave.
Thank you. My name is Bob Handy, and I retired from the Navy in 1970. Walter had invited me to come to the class, but for my own personal reasons, I never came. I served with the Marines in 3rd Marine Division and the 1st Marine Division in Vietnam, and I was very much opposed, even while I was in, wearing a peace symbol after work, to the Vietnam War. I got involved in politics because of the Vietnam War. One of the greatest things that I ever did in my life was I asked Walter Capps to run for Congress. And Walter didn't win the first time, but Walter was not a quitter. And because Walter Capps ran, this country is a better place. Right now, the Vietnam veterans know the problems that they had when they came home. A few years ago, myself and a group of other veterans formed a group called Veterans United for Truth. You may have read about us. We are suing the Veterans Administration for lack of care, for PTSD, for the tremendous amount of suicides that are going on, for traumatic brain injury, and for the whole plethora of things that the Vietnam veterans suffered through that we do not want these new kids to have to face. I would invite you to join us. It doesn't cost anything, although we are a 501c3 and we do accept donations. But if you go to the website, VUFT, the initials of Veterans United for Truth, if you really care about what happened to us and what are happening to these new kids that are coming back, I would invite you to join us. Dr. Ira Katz, who's the head of he's a high and mighty mucky muck in the Veterans Administration, in front of Congress said there were 738 known cases of suicide with the Veterans Administration. The other day we proved in court that there are 18 veterans committing suicide every single day. Please, if you really care about veterans, join us. It's Veterans United for Truth. It's the initials VUFT.org. And I want to say one other last thing. One of the saddest days of my life was when I was driving home and heard Walter died. But Lois, she was filling his shoes so wonderfully. Thank you so much.
There are just a couple more things, so I'd like you to just stay with us for just a few more minutes. You know, most of you who raised your hand and said you took the class with Walter between 79 and 89 were not fortunate enough to be here on this campus with Chancellor Henry Young. And he's made an enormous contribution to our campus, to the life of our community, and I'd like to invite him to say a word or two.
You know, I came to this campus in '94. Is Stelling here, my wife? She's right there. We came to '94. One Sunday morning, I turned on television. That was in Indiana, in this AE channel. I saw this powerful professor was teaching a course, Vietnam course, you know, the voice of the stranger. So I told my wife, I said, take a look. I started to become his fan even before I came to UC Santa Barbara. So when I came here, because it connects to my own personal life as well. You all went through wars, but I went through all of them. I was born after Pearl Harbor. You can just imagine. I was not living in the U.S. I lived in a place that actually the war was going on. Yeah, and then the Civil War of China, and then the Vietnam War. I was very close to that. Then the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and all the kinds of Asian wars. So I thought that this course, what he had, is just such a tremendous, extreme value to life. So I came to UC Santa Barbara. I remember one morning he called me. He said, Henry, would you come to my Vietnam course to give a lecture? I said, oh, what? It's just my reward of my life. So I went to talk. I don't even remember what I said. It's all just from my heart. So I just across the hall from my office to Campbell Hall. So I became his fan and admirer. Then one day he told me, he said, when Walter wanted to talk to things very serious, he put his hands in his pocket, look at his shoes. So I just waiting, what's coming? He said, I'm going to run for Congress. So then after he was elected, I had such a good time with him. Every time when I see him, he said, I'm now on a science committee. He wanted to know the science, the life, the religion, the humanities, how they connected to each other. His view just as big as the universe. It's just such a joy to talk to him. Then, of course, after 10 and a half months, I still remember that day. I heard that shocking news. I could not even stand still. But then today I saw this gathering we called Coming Home. I still remember that night coming home. We waited and waited. Lois, that was almost midnight. That big airplane, C-5A, landed. So we went to Port Mugu Airport. I saw all those, his supporters and all that, just there supporting him. And he came back wrapped with American flag. I can't speak anymore. But then the beautiful thing is that those young men, young women, they are following him, following his ideals, his students, his supporters, we all rally around Lois. So Lois was our hope, strength. And Lois, your strength is absolutely admirable. Your wisdom, your sacrifice, your dedication, and everyone loves you. Everyone appreciates you. I want to say that. And when Lois became the congressman, on our campus, when we have problems, people come to her, don't come to me anymore. So I really thank you. You know all of my problems. Yeah, when the problem gets most critical, they always ask me, did you talk to Lois? I say, I did. Lois even wrote a letter. I got the letter. So every time when you wrote a letter, you really helped me a great deal. I want to say thank you also. But all these are not as important as, I tell you, Walter is up there somewhere. He is saying, thank you, Lois. He appreciates what you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Yang. Now, before we go off to other things in the reunion, I want to just remind you that we are marking the 10th year since Walter's death, and by rededicating ourselves to a whole series of Walter's values, and the way that I sort of thought of them were his contributions to what I call democratic liberal politics, to issues related to war and peace and veterans. And then there's another element, and that is Walter as the great scholar of religion. And he came with Lois in 1964, which was a year after probably the most important Supreme Court decision involving the academic study of religion, the Schempp case. And I really think that it was Walter's contribution to my department that really made it one of the best departments in the nation for a number of reasons. But, you know, there's a way that you can tell the quality of a teacher by his students. And so part of our marking of the anniversary is that we're going to have a meeting in 2 weeks of many of his own students. Edward Linenthal, David Chittister, Tomoko Masuzawa, Wendy Wright. I'm even going to do something. And then one of his senior colleagues, Jonathan Z. Smith, who has become probably one of the most important scholars in the field and sort of was under Walter's tutelage, as I remember, for a period of time when he was here. And then Robert Orsi, who is one of the most important American religious historians. So this event, and you have it on this sheet, it's on the 10th, it's the 9th and 10th, beginning at 9 a.m. in the morning each day. And if you're in Santa Barbara, please join us. And we are already, or at least Wilson, Jim, and I, are thinking about the 30th anniversary of this course next winter. And if you haven't signed up one of these sheets for contact with the CAP Center, please do so before you leave, and I'd like to see you next February. Thank you very, very much.